Compared to Chapter 5, Chapter 6 will seem like a proverbial walk in the park, because now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about graphing. First, we're going to graph some points, then we're going to learn how to graph linear equations, and at the end of Chapter 6, we'll talk a little bit about slope, but you can wait to get to that point. Chapter 6.1 is very basic, so I'm only going to do one problem in 6.1. Then we're going to go back up to the top of this page to look at Chapter 6.2. But we'll do both Chapter 6.1 and 6.2 in this one lesson. In Chapter 6.1, if you look at problem number 20, it says x minus 3y equals 9. For the first time, we have two variables, x and y. And when it comes to graphing, they use x and y coordinates, and that's why so often they'll use the x or the y as the variable in the solution of problems because of the graphing. Now, what you need to know is when we talk about points involving the x-y coordinates in our graph, the x is always listed first and the y is listed second. You need to keep that in mind so you don't get those confused. Later on, when we're talking about slope, we're going to talk about y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1, those kinds of things. You need to keep those x and y's in their proper position. So it's important to realize that when we're talking about graphing points, and later when we're talking about graphing equations, the sequence is always points are x first, y second. All right. So if we have this x minus 3y equals 9, and we have these 4 points listed right below it. The first one is 0, and then comma, we don't know the answer to that. The second one is 12, comma, we don't know the answer to that. What we see in these first two is we are given the coordinate for x, but we know we need to solve for the coordinate for y. So this is the way it works. We take our equation, x minus 3y equals 9, and we plug in this value for x. In the first case, that value happens to be 0. So what we do is we just put in 0 minus 3y equals 9. And now what we do is we take minus 3y divided by negative 3 equals 9 divided by negative 3, and y equals negative 3. So now in the first one, we've got our answer, negative 3. Now let's take a look at the second one. In this particular case, now in the x position, we're going to put the number 12. We rewrite our formula again, x minus 3y equals 9. And this time we put in a 12 minus 3y equals 9. So we have to subtract 12 from both sides. We get negative 3y equals negative 3. And then negative 3y, and I'm sorry, I merged that there, over negative 3 equals negative 3 over negative 3. And therefore a positive y equals a positive 1. So in our second one, now what we figured out is our coordinates will be 12 and 1. Let's take a look at the third one. In the third one, what we've got is our formula x minus 3y equals 9. But instead of substituting in for x, now we have a value for y. And that y value happens to be 0. Minus 3 times 0 equals 9. And 3 times 0 is 0, so we end up with x equals 9. All right, so in this particular case, we say our x is equal to 9. And in our last one now, we have x minus 3y equals 9. And we substitute in for y, x minus 3 times negative 2 equals 9. Negative 3 times negative 2 gives me x plus 6 equals 9. Subtracting 6 from both sides, what I get is x equals 3. And so, in our last one, our coordinates are 3 and negative 2. Now, that's really pretty simple, and you should be able to handle 6.1 with not any difficulty. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to erase what we just had there, and then what I'm going to do is move up on the page because I've set it up so that we can look at some of the problems in chapter 6.2. Again, these are not that difficult. If you turn in your books to page 391, what we're going to do is talk about plotting points. I want to talk a little bit about the x and y coordinates. All right? You'll see those graphs from now all the way through chapter 7. So if you want to look, you can look on page 391 and you'll see a couple of graphs with x and y coordinates. Now, our x and y coordinates, you'll notice the x-axis is horizontal, runs right and left. Now, the O in my diagram here stands for the origin. That's where the x and y axis crosses. It's right there in the middle. On our x-axis, if our x value is positive, we start at that origin and we go to the right along the x-axis. But if our x value is negative, we start at the origin and we go to the left. Now, when we talk about the y coordinate, we start at the origin, but now we go up and down. Some people call it north and south if you want. And if our y value happens to be positive, we go up the x, our y-axis. If our y value happens to be negative, we go down the y-axis. We're going to plot a bunch of points. And in problems 24, 26, and 30, what we're trying to figure out is which of the four coordinates or quadrants does the value reside. So if you take a look at what I've done here on the screen, you'll notice that I've labeled the four quadrants. The one in the upper right is quadrant number 1. In quadrant number 1, both the x and y values are always positive. To its left is quadrant number 2. In quadrant number 2, the x value is negative, but the y value is positive. In quadrant number 3, both the x and y values are negative. And in quadrant number 4, which is down on the lower right, the x values are positive, but the y values are negative. So let's go ahead and plot some points. We're taking a look at number 12. It says point N is 0, negative 3. What I do in plotting a point is I first go along the x-axis. All right? Well, we can't go anywhere along the x-axis because it's 0. So since it's 0, we're right along, we're right in the middle, right at the origin. And now it says negative 3, so what we do is we go down from the origin to negative 3, and that's our point, and that is point N. In 14, Q is 5, 0. Well, now we can go along the x-axis, and since it's a positive 5, we're going to the right. Once we get to that 5, the y-axis says we're not going anywhere, so it's right there. We don't go up or down, and this is Q. But now with number 16, we have a negative 3, negative 4. So here, what we want to do, first along the x-axis, this is our negative 3, x always being the first term. So we go to the left 3, negative 3. And now because y is negative 4, we'll go down 1, 2, 3, 4. So our point is right about here, and that is point S. In number 18, now we have sort of the opposite. We have a positive 4 and a positive 3 for G. So we go along our x-axis first, and since it's positive, we go to the right 4 places. And now, because the y is also positive, we go up 3 places, and we place it right about here, and that's point G. Now for number 20, it says I is -3 and 0. All right, along the x-axis we go -3, but since y is neither positive or negative, it sits right there, and that happens to be point I. For 22, point K is 0, 6. Well, because it's neither going to the right or left on the x-axis, it sits right along the y-axis. And along the y-axis, we have to go up 6. So K sits right here. Number 24, we want to know which quadrant number 24 is in. Well, since you know that the first quadrant is all positives, x and y are positive, quadrant number 2, the x is negative, the y is positive. You don't really have to plot it, but we're going to plot it anyways. So we go -1, 2, 3, and then we go a +2. So we point that point right there. That's for number 24. And we see that's in quadrant 2. In number 26, we're going to the right first because the x is positive. It's a +2, 1, 2. But now we're going down the y-axis below because it's a -4. So we get down 1, 2, 3, 4. It sits right here. That's number 26. And therefore, number 26 happens to be in the 4th quadrant. And finally, in number 30, we're going -3, 1, 2, 3. And then we're going -7 along the y-axis. That puts it clear down here. And that is number 30. And it sits in the 3rd quadrant. Now, the whole purpose of these first two sections of Chapter 6 is learning how to properly plot points. This is critically important to Chapter 6.3, where we're going to start graphing linear equations.